All right, 1302, let's get at it. This is chapter 23. It's called The U.S. and the Cold War. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the Cold War, which technically started in 1947, shortly after the U.S. had pretty much left Europe after World War II. That doesn't say we're still not there, but we do have troops there. But what we're going to do is we are going to end up calling the Soviets out for having taken over a number of countries after the war, World War II. And where it's going to start is when one of our State Department employees, George F. Kennan, who'd been deployed to Moscow, is going to end up writing a telegram, a rather long one. It's about 8,000 words. And in this document, he is basically going to outline a theory of containment. And what that basically means is we are not going to allow the Soviets to encroach into the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's not going to be a military war per se. What it's going to end up being is an ideological war. It's basically capitalism versus communism. All right, and you know, you should know the definition of capitalism pretty well by now. Now, communism, again, it's just state control over all the major facets of industry, communication, industry, military, politics, media, everything. Everything goes through a central state apparatus. Now, one of the things that's going to happen is once the State Department telegram reaches Washington, D.C., Truman, who's the president that took over for FDR, is going to basically issue what he calls the Truman Doctrine. And what that is aid and money to democratic nations throughout the world in exchange for them trying to stop communism spreading to their country. And it's military aid, money, food, medicine, political advisors, you name it. We send it worldwide. Now, just to kind of give you a frame of reference with regards to this containment theory, it's going to last roughly from 1947 to 1993 with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 91. And the first real test is going to be in Greece and Turkey after the war. And what you're going to end up with is you have two nations that are in terrible shape because of the war. And they, because of their proximity to Russia, were ripe for the taking. And what the United States is going to do is render a bunch of aid to this area in hopes of thwarting the Soviet threat. All right, and again, it's all about keeping the Soviets out of the Western Hemisphere. Now, something else that's going to happen is the United States is going to issue something called the Marshall Plan, and it's military, it's humanitarian effort that basically 17 nations are going to take part with the leadership of the United States with direct aid to Europe in the billions in order to keep these nations from slipping in the hands of communism. Now, there's no real strings attached here, but it's just one of those things where if we don't aid these countries after the end of the war, we were looking at communism spreading. All right, another thing that's going to happen on the horizon. Winston Churchill, who was voted out of office shortly after the war, is going to come to the United States kind of on a thank you tour on behalf of the United States. And he's going to end up in a town called Fulton, Missouri, at Westminster College. And it's there that he ushers not a command, but he just kind of tells the United States exactly what's at stake. And it's called the Iron Curtain speech. And what he's basically saying is the Soviets are going to cast out a net far and wide, erect a wall, and try to take over Europe as much as possible. And while Truman kind of kind of keeps his distance with regards to making some kind of declaration like that, Churchill comes right out and says it for him. And again, he's traveling around the United States. Although he'd lost the election in his own home country, he was seen as a hero in the United States, and he got a hero's welcome. As kind of a big sweeping overview with this chapter, the United States has got to do whatever it can to rebuild Europe, rebuild Japan, again, trying to keep the Soviets out of that sphere. You're going to get a blockade, and this is in Berlin, which is going to end up being the epicenter of the Cold War. The Soviets are going to keep aid from going from east to west. And it's largely just water, electricity, and other items that would have normally been shared amongst Berliners. And the United States, with this blockade, is going to end up flying a bunch of supplies over Berlin to the west and to the east, trying to save the people there. Again, Berlin's a big mess because of World War II. You're going to get an organization started. It's called NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And what this is, it's an organization of about 20 nations that are all committed to stopping the Soviets. Now, while we have NATO, the Soviets enact something called the Warsaw Pact. And that basically is all of the Soviet-controlled countries: Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, just a whole plethora of nations that are now under their control. Now, something else that we're going to do is we're going to establish called NSC 68, and what that is a commitment for a military buildup. And again, this is just a special deployment of money, aid, and an apparatus to keep the Soviets at bay. And one of the extensions of this is going to be when we convert the OSS into the CIA. Now, you're finally going to get a confrontation between democracy and communism in an actual war, and what it's going to end up being is a hot war. Where the Cold War is ideological, the hot war is going to actually be a military confrontation. Now, what you're going to get here is China invades South Korea to unite North and South and impose communist rule, and they cross over what they call the 38th parallel. Now, what's going to happen is the Republican Congress is going to charge that Truman is soft on communism. And what he is going to do is he is going to plead with the UN to step in, which they do. But again, the UN wasn't in the best of straits. It only been formalized in 1947 in San Francisco. So really, this confrontation at the 38th parallel really ends up in the hands of the United States. They're the ones. They're going to have to come in and keep the Chinese from completely taking over and making South Korea, communist. All right, so let's turn the page here. Now, at this time, what you're also going to get is a second Red Scare at home. And what you have is Congress and the State Department had been infiltrated by Soviets or communist ideology. And what the government is going to do is it's going to put forth something called a loyalty oath. And what you get there is Congress is now going to start going through Congress. Congress is going to start having what they call House Un-American Activity Committee hearings. And they're going to out congressmen and State Department employees, local and state government employees, Hollywood, colleges and university professors, in the hopes of just getting them to expose their ideology or their type of thinking. Basically, the question is, are you a communist or are you a commie? And a lot of Democrats who had left leanings are going to be called in on all this. Yeah, it's a very scary time in the 50s with regards to that. They were hoping that neighbors would start outing neighbors with regards to all this. Much like today, you have people being called out to testify against Americans with regards to their loyalties to our country, much like they did with the January 6 hearings. Now, we need to talk about China just a little bit more. Mao, who's the chairman of the Communist Party, is going to wage a civil war in China between 1927 and 1947. It's an ideological war. It's the communists against the nationalists. And the Red Chinese will end up beating the nationalists, who basically led by Chiang Kai-shek. And Chiang Kai-shek is someone that we were supporting during not only World War II, but we're also supporting him against the Red Chinese. And the Red Chinese will eventually win. Now, interestingly enough, in the Far East, we did hold the Communist Front. And the nationalists are going to end up fleeing China and going to Taiwan. Now, that name should sound familiar because in Taiwan, that's where the nationalists end up, and they basically establish their own country or their own territory. And interestingly enough, the Chinese, the Red Chinese today, still argue that Taiwan is theirs and they want it back. And that's one of the areas that the United States is specifically interested in protecting against the spread of the Red Chinese in the Far East, and that's one of the reasons why it's been in the news lately. We're trying to protect democracy in Taiwan. And now remember one other thing, Taiwan is also the place where we get a lot of our computer chips. So it's kind of like save democracy, but also save our supply of computer chips and some kind of a presence in the Pacific Rim. Alright, so let's take a look at culture wars. And what you basically have here is you have the United States government is now implementing a campaign to win the hearts and minds of people under the guise of freedom, economic, religious, social, and cultural, through something called Radio Free Europe. And believe it or not, we also had a Radio Free Asia. And what this is these are radio broadcasts that for the most part are going to put forth American ideology, democratic ideology, in the hopes that people hearing this get an alternative voice to what the communists are put forth. And this is going to happen in Europe and in Asia. And up until just recently, where they shut these Radio Free Europe and Asia stations down, they've been serving as kind of a mouthpiece of the American government. Alright, culture wars. You're also going to get abstract expressionism by a man by the name of Jackson Pollock. And he is going to do it through art. You are also going to get a group of writers called the Beats that were poets and literary minds, and they're going to write stories and publish books, basically attacking the status quo. And that should be something that's near in your near and dear to your hearts. I've been talking a lot about this, and you should see on your sheet for your PowerPoint presentation. One of the groups that's going to be on this is the beats, and we'll talk more about the beats here when I get to chapter 24. You're also going to get the UN, for the most part, that's going to promote something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And with this, again, we're going to be using the UN to hopefully get the world to not only hear the message from us, but also these bodies of nations that are going to embrace this Declaration of Human Rights. And interestingly enough, when the UN was formed in San Francisco, its headquarters was placed in New York City, of all places. Now, when I was talking about cultural wars just a little bit ago, you're going to be introduced to a man by the name of George Orwell. Orwell was a writer that survived World War II. He went to an island called Jara, where he's going to end up writing a dystopian book about what happens when totalitarian regimes take over. And originally, and this hasn't been proven, but there was some thought that the original title of the book was 1948, and his publisher said, no, that's too soon after the war. You're going to scare the bejesus out of your readers. You need to change the title. So for the longest time, everybody, thought, oh my God, 1984, it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Well, 1984 came and went, and you really didn't see much of it. But if you've read this book, and you may end up reading it next year, you'll find out we live in a Orwellian world. Think police, just all kinds of stuff. Government watching you, Big Brother watching you. It's just a really, really, really interesting book. And it's not a far stretch to say we live in an Orwellian world. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next chapter. Now, let's get back to Truman. Much of what we've been talking about is foreign policy. What I want to do is talk about Truman on the domestic front. He is going to issue something called the Truman Fair Deal. And it's not too far of a stretch, but it ends up really kind of an extension of the New Deal and the second New Deal. What you're going to get is the government is going to put forth a safety net. They're going to increase Social Security benefits. They're going to push for a minimum wage. They're going to push for money for public housing. There's going to be talk about universal health care. They're also going to be talking about more money for education from the federal government to state and local municipalities. Within Congress, you're going to get somewhat of a Republican rebuke, because what they don't want with all these benefit programs is the government getting in the middle of everybody's personal life. And the charge is you're going to tax the rich and give to the poor, or you're going to encroach in everybody's individualism. And sad to say, but if you look at this list, these kind of arguments are still going on today. And here it's 1947, and we're still talking about this stuff for the most part in 2025. Sad, but true. And again, Truman's idea is to flip foreign policy to domestic policy, turn the wartime economy into a peacetime economy. So you have war to peacetime economy. And it makes a lot of sense. If you look at the amount of monies that were spent on this war, now we're not waging war. So maybe what we do is take that money and shift it to the American government, the American the American people. Yeah. So here it is in 1947. The money's made or spent. Here we go from roughly 22.9 to 13.2. All right. So here what you had is in 1945, that's what we were spending. And then this is what they're proposing in 1947. And believe it or not, what they're basically looking at is just taking the expenditures of the war and shifting it to a defense type of economy. Now, one thing to consider, the total outlays is this. 83.9% of that budget went to the military. Now what he wants to do is reduce it. And it's going to be a battle between the Republicans. You're basically a battle between the Republicans and the Democrats on what to do with all this money that should have been saved from the war. Alright, so let's turn the page. Just got a little ways to go. Some other concerns. Now, what you're looking at is within the Democratic Party, you are going to get a schism. And what's going to happen is the Dixiecrats, which were Democrats that thought that the Democratic Party was becoming too liberal, are now going to start to look at labor and rebuke it. And these are Southern Democrats that are slowly but surely starting to turn more and more conservative. And they look at labor union as anti-American, and this is going to stay this way for quite some time. You're going to get the Taft-Hartley Act, which is a bunch of labor disputes, and this is basically promises not kept from the war. Much like World War I, we made all these promises to labor. The war is over, the economy is shifting, and now labor isn't seeing the benefits of all these promises that were made, and they're now going to start striking, which is going to cause issues within our own economy. You're going to get inflation. You're going to get stagnant wages. It's just a real mess that's going to take place for about 4 or 5 years. You're also going to get post-World War II civil rights. The NAACP is going to start to become stronger. They're going to start making inroads in the South with combating the abuses of Jim Crow law and discrimination, housing, employment, and most of all these talks will end up in Congress. And one of the most important court cases that's going to come out of all this is going to be Brown versus the Board of Education. And that's where the NAACP challenged the legal precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson with regards to legalized segregation, especially in education. You're going to start to get some inroads with Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson's going to be the first African American player to actually participate in Major League Baseball. Again, I mentioned the Dixiecrats just a little bit early. As they continue to move towards splitting their party, they'll break away and establish a third party. In Congress, you're going to get McCarthyism, and again, it kind of goes back to that House Un-Americans Activities Committee that I talked about. Some will deem it a witch hunt. And what is going to be under attack with this is the First Amendment right, which is basically freedom of speech, and then the Fifth Amendment right, which is basically due process. And this is all going to play out on TV, radio, and the newspapers. And this is going to go on from roughly 1952 up until about 1962. So it's almost a whole decade of this stuff going on. The Hollywood 10, much like what I said earlier about them going after State Department employees, congressmen, all the departments, they're going to go after Hollywood. They're going to go after college professors. And this is especially true with regards to Hollywood. What they want to do is get some of the low-hanging fruit, some of the lower strata of Hollywood, to basically out communists within the film industry. What they really want to do is go after the bigwigs. But really all they end up doing is basically getting roughly about 10 prominent directors, bringing them into Congress, and they're going to appear under the House on American Activities Committee hearings, and some of them are going to end up going to jail. And a lot of your Hollywood actors and actresses are going to get upset, and they're going to picket for them because they see an infringement on their First Amendment and Fifth Amendment rights. And you've heard me talk about the Fifth Amendment before. That's basically your right to not incriminate yourself. Yeah, and that's what these guys basically end up doing. They challenge the committee. What exactly do you have on me? And unfortunately, much of this information is classified information, so not even their lawyers could actually see it, because their lawyers, for the most part, didn't have security clearances. So these people are basically walking into these hearings blind, and in some cases actually hearing this stuff for the first time, which was really, really crazy. Here you're asking all these questions, but they couldn't hear the evidence against them vocally, or could they see their accusers? Just a real mess altogether. All right, some other issues with regards to the State Department or Congress. You're going to have a spy by the name of Alger Hess that is outed for having given, by a friend of his, Whittaker Chambers. He is going to be outed for having given information to the Soviets. Now, he's going to claim his innocence. These so-called files, or this paperwork, was on microfilm, supposedly placed into a pumpkin, and what you're going to end up with is these files. They show Richard Nixon basically holding this microfilm up to the cameras, and it's a big show. And again, he pleads innocence all the way to the end. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, you find out later he was in fact a spy. He was giving them secrets, and his claim of innocence was basically for naught. He was an atomic spy, or a spy for the Soviets. Richard Nixon became very famous because of this, of his hard stance against communists. You're also going to get another famous case. It's called the Rosenbergs. And this is a couple that lived in New York. The brother of the wife, her name was Ethel Rosenberg, had a brother named David Greengrass. And he worked on the Manhattan Project. And what he was doing was stealing secrets and then giving it to her brother, brother-in-law, Julius, who then turned around and gave them to the Soviets. And interestingly enough, this couple was brought up on charges. They were given a trial and then later executed. They're the only two American citizens ever put to death because of espionage during this period. So yes, they were put to death as atomic spies. You're also going to get some issues with regards to the Middle East, and much again of this is the fraying of relations throughout the world. One is going to be Iran, where we help through the CIA of all agencies, a coup d'état where we depose one guy and put in another guy, and the guy that we are going to end up putting in power is going to be the Shah of Iran. And interestingly enough, he's going to do our bidding for almost 20 some years until 1979, where he's actually deposed by the Islamic State led by Ayatollah Khomeini, and that's where it remains even today. And again, he's another leader that we help prop up in another country somewhere else to do our bidding. Was it about oil? Yes, but it was also keeping the Soviets out of the Middle East. You're going to get another country that's going to be in turmoil, and what you have is Nasser, who's the president of Egypt, is going to seize the Suez Canal. And who owned the Suez Canal, or who ran the canal, is Great Britain. And we are going to come to the aid of Great Britain. And interestingly enough, the Egyptians are going to win, and they're going to actually take over control of the Suez Canal. And it's much like our Panama Canal. A lot of products go through there, and it's very important with regards to navigation from the Persian Gulf up into the Mediterranean, and then the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. You're also going to get a hot spot in Southeast Asia, and that was where France was ousted from Vietnam. Up until this point, yeah, the communists had a presence, but they weren't ever able to really get rid of the French, and they're going to eventually do it. And then what's going to happen is Ho Chi Minh, who is a communist, is going to take over. Now, interestingly enough, he's not a Russian communist, and for the most part, he's not a Chinese communist. It's kind of like he's somewhere in between. And his whole goal is to unite his country, North and South. And he, interestingly enough, had approached Woodrow Wilson at the Paris Peace Talks in 1919 to help him have that come about. And unfortunately, that did not work out at all, because Wilson kind of Wilson did blow him off. Now, out of this, and this is in 1954, Ike, who's the president, is now going to issue the domino theory. And what the domino theory is if one nation falls in the the Southeast Asia, they'll all fall. So if Vietnam falls, Laos, Cambodia, and all these other nations will follow suit with regards to communism. And here it is. It's already 1954, and we're already looking at Vietnam as a hot spot. And it's kind of sad, but we kind of put it on the back burner, and then it's all going to come to fruition by 1964 into 1965, where finally the VC, led by Ho, are going to infiltrate South Vietnam, and that's when you end up with the Vietnam War, or also known as the American War, or what some people will call the Vietnam conflict. All right, so here you have it. This is the first real big, strong installment of the 1950s. Part 1 is very heavy on foreign policy. What you'll get with Chapter 24 is we're going to be looking at the domestic and cultural side of the 1950s. Rock and roll, Elvis. Again, we're going to be looking at Hollywood. Again, it's just more domestic stuff than foreign policy. All right, so this lecture goes about 35 minutes. I guess you could say it's short and sweet. A little shorter than having it all out on the board. I would have wrote a heck of a lot more, but unfortunately, this is one of those things where just to fit it in and do it this way, it works. You got a really good taste of what this chapter is about, and I hope you enjoy this viewing.